Section 19 of the Soul, or Rational Psychology. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Travis Bissell. The Soul, or Rational Psychology, by Emanuel Swedenborg. Translated by Frank Sewall, 1837 to 1915, and others. Section 19. 14. Of the lower mind, or animus, and its affections in particular. 197. To the brain are attributed sensations, as the sight, hearing, smell, taste, and touch. Wherefore the brain is called the common sensory. Its organs and instruments are in the body and of the body, such as the eye, ear, nostrils, tongue, and skin. These do not feel, but they distinguish, receive, and transmit the forms of touch to the brain, which is the reason why, when the brain is diseased, the senses, which appear as if they were in the organs themselves, grow languid. 198. Sensations, however, are not attributed to the animus or lower mind, but those affections which also are called its passions. For the cerebrum feels, but is affected by sensations according to its form. Therefore, the animus is the form of the ideas of the common or external sensory, and the active and living principle of all the changes of the body. As the animus is affected, so it desires, and as the desire of the animus, such is the pleasure of the body. For the animus is such as the form of the sensory is, thus from the form of the sensory we may judge of the animus, and from the animus we may judge of the sensory. 199. The affections of the animus either agree or disagree in general with the common sensory. Those which agree are pleasant, those which disagree are unpleasant. Pleasant affections expand the brain and diffuse the animus. Unpleasant affections compress the brain and confine the animus. But irregular affections twist the brain and confuse the animus. Pleasant affections refresh the brain and exhilarate the animus. Unpleasant ones wound the brain and sadden the animus. Pleasant affections restore the brain with new heat and the animus with new life. But unpleasant affections destroy the brain and extinguish the animus. Thus, pleasant affections are so many heatings of the brain and consequently of the body, and so many resuscitations of the life of the animus, and consequently of the sensations and actions of the body. But the unpleasant affections are so many torpors and frigidnesses of the brain and therefore of the body, and so many perils of the life, and swoons and deaths of the animus, and thus of the sensations and actions of the body. For the animus and its affections, both pleasant and unpleasant, die out with the brain. 200. There are several kinds and numberless species of affections of the animus, as joy and sadness, patience and anger, loves and hatreds, envy, courage and fear, temperance and intemperance, clemency and cruelty, ambition and pride, liberality and avarice, and many more. But there are those which belong to the common sensory, and the animus, and are called the animal affections, and those which belong to the internal sensory and its mind, and are called the rational affections, and there are those which participate in both. Therefore we must treat of each in particular. Joy. 201. Joy is a general affection of pleasure, for all pleasant affections delight and gladden, or cause joy. Its causes are all those harmonies in general and in particular, which accord or agree with our sensories and please them, especially with the internal sensory, when this is looking to fortune, to happiness, to the restoration of life or of body. Joy expands the cerebrum and diffuses the animus, to which it slackens the bridle, as it were, allowing it to act freely. This expansion of the cerebrum and diffusion of the animus is visible in the face itself, in its sensorial organs, which likewise are animated, and in the whole body which, before constrained, swells freely in joy. Through the general expansion, by extended swellings of the cortical substance of the cerebrum, each internal sensory also is expanded. In this state one does not compress another, whence we awaken into a certain more perfect life, just as from a sleep. The blood flows more freely through somewhat larger and somewhat smaller vessels, and runs through its own glands and fibers. Once the universal chyle of the brain and economy of the body is restored. For whatever is the animus of the cerebrum, the same is transfused into the body, since there is a continuity of all from their own origins or cortical substances. This is the reason why we are able, from the body, to judge of the affection of the cerebrum or of the internal common sensory, and especially from the countenance on which is inscribed the mind. In excessive joy, not only are the muscles of the cortex, the medullary strata, and the fibrous and vascular canals of the brain and body opened, but also the pores of the cranium and bones. Then also such passages as the chyliferous, lymphatic, and salivary ducts, and other pour out liquids suitable for animal economy, as do also the transpiratory pores of the skin. Thus through joy all ways of communication are opened. In the state of joy, an agreeable and pleasing tremor, also the vital heat, the light, the presence of the animus, is diffused around the common external sensory as well as the internal. This lively trembling and light in the countenance is manifestly betrayed by the eyes and by the speech itself and every action. Thence also the brain is cleared, restored, and vivified, and in that moment glides back as it were into the state of its first youth and innocence. Besides this subtle trembling, also more visible vibration or laughter arises, for the brain leaps and oscillates, and in the same way the lungs, the windpipe, articulated sounds, the face, and joints of the body. This is called laughter, for joy itself is an affection of the internal sensory, but laughter rather of the common sensory or brain, which is unable to exist without the inmost joy of the internal sensory, and a reflection of its intellect, whence laughter is not given except in man, for in order that it may exist the mind must perceive a cause for joy, and see a present or foresee a future happiness, which thus breaks into a tremulous effect from the inmost. In a state of joy the mind is inclined to every kind of waving and motion to and fro, as in a beating time to music, to leapings and tossings of the limbs, of vibration and actual reciprocation, because all things are loosened and set free. The first degree of joy is to be content with one's lot, second, hilarity, third, joy, and the fourth, which is also the last effect, is laughter and a flinging of the body. Sadness. 202. Sadness, however, which is also termed sorrow and distress of mind, is the general unpleasant affection, for all unpleasant affections cause sadness. The causes are all discords, in general and in particular, which disagree with, or are not fitting to our sensories, especially to the internal sensory, when it perceives or suspects misfortune, unhappiness, the extinction of life, or the destruction of the body. Sadness compresses the brain and torments the animus, casting it, as it were, into fetters and chains, and depriving it of its liberty. This constriction of the brain and anxiety of the mind appear in the countenance, in its sensorial organs, which are likewise compressed, so that tears are forced out, as also in the whole body, which before expanded is now manifestly contracted. Through the general constriction of the brain, the muscles of the cortical substance being closed, every internal sensory is restrained and loses its liberty of acting, for in this state one compresses the other, whence the brain becomes heavy and torpid. The blood is impeded, nor does it flow freely through the greater and smaller vessels, or it is denied to the purer blood or animal spirit to flow through the glands and fibers, whence is cacocemia, ataxia, atrophia, melancholy, and the causes of many diseases. In the deepest sadness, not only are the cortica beds and medullary strands of the cerebrum, of the cerebellum, of the oblong and spinal medulla constricted, and the fibrous and vascular canals of the brain as well as the body, but also the pores of the skull and of the bones and the passages, as the caelifrous, the lymphatic, and others which pour out liquids serviceable for the animal economy, all of which, if compressed, do not fulfill their uses in the kingdom. Thus, through sadness, all the ways of communication are, as to some parts, closed. In the state of sadness, an unpleasant torpor and stupor, coldness, darkness, absence of mind, and of animus occupy the common as well as the internal sensory. This torpor and darkness appear manifestly in the countenance, eyes, and speech. Hence the brain is as it were clouded and obscured, twisted, vexed, destroyed, and the mind extinguished, or falls into a kind of premature old age. In sadness, because the brain suffers and the single ducts are compressed and strive to raise themselves, there arises the effect, the opposite of laughter, namely, weeping and bewailing. Sadness itself is an affection of the internal sensory, but weeping is of the common or external sensory, that is, of the brain, and it cannot exist without the deepest sadness of the internal sensory, and without a reflection upon an unhappy condition and misfortune present or future. Wherefore weeping does not occur except in man, nor can it arise except from a mixed intellect, which does not know the future. The first degree of sadness is not to be content with one's lot. Another is a certain concealed anxiety. A third is sadness itself and grief of mind. The fourth, or last, which is the effect, is weeping, bewailing, and inaction of the muscles of the body. Loves in general. 203. There are many species of affections of the animus which are called loves, such as venereal love, conjugal love, the love of parents towards their children, or storge, and friendships. The several loves are, as it were, so many conjunctions, bindings, consociations of parts with a whole. For to live without love is as a part disunited from a whole. For every part, that it may live, draws its lot in life from the common body, or from participation with many. Society is the very form of living for the several parts. The quality of the life of the single member flows from the form of the many or of the society. Thus, a single life without this connection is respectively nothing, and that it may be something loves are conceited, by which we are connected and through which we regard our friends as ourselves, as united and not separated. Thus, there are loves of the body or venereal loves, loves of the animus, as conjugal love, and the love of friends. And there are loves of the mind, loves of the intellectory, loves of the soul. From these things it can be seen that love properly is vital heat itself, and the very force of life. For without love, the single members would become torpid and extinct. Venereal love. 204. The venereal act of love is a conjunction itself and union of two bodies into one. The cause of this is said to be most deeply hidden even from the soul and the pure intellect. These regard effects not as effects, but as ends, and their ends are that society may exist and that members of society may be produced, both of a terrestrial society, which is of the pure intellect, and of a celestial society, which is of the soul. The rational mind itself, partly from itself and partly from things revealed, perceives and understands these ends. The animus simply desires the effect, and the body obeys. How great is the desire of this end in the mind and in the pure intellect becomes manifestly apparent in the delights and in the stimulations of the body to that effect. 205. Venereal desire is excited by objects of the five senses, evidently by beauty and loveliness presented to the sight, or by a similar form and charm described by language, which by the hearing passes into so many objects of sight. Likewise by objects of the three senses of touch, through kissing, embracing, and many other acts. Thus love progressively increases in this venereal affection, because it is pleasing and the first of the alluring affections. The brain itself, or the common sensory, is expanded and joyfully trembles, whence the animus is diffused. The sensories themselves, and indeed the internal motors, are determined into that state in which they call forth and draw out the whole spirit, which thus far lies enclosed in the blood, and they promptly pour it forth through their own medullary fibers and through the nerves of the body. The intellectory affords in abundant measure new life and spirit, for in this state is conceived, born, and copiously put forth the spiritual essence, which is to serve the new offspring to be conceived. A state similar to that of the brain is felt in the whole body, and in its sanguineous and fibrous systems, which unanimously conspire to the same effect. For whatever animus the brain has is diffused into the body, besides all the other ways of transpiration are opened, and abundance of effluvious breathings flows out into and breaks forth through the whole circuit of the body. For these reasons, after the effect arises lassitude and torpor, for all the better blood is robbed of its own spiritual essence. Also the purer flows to the sensories, in order that in the fibers and through the fibers it may at length be discharged into the members of generation. Even the fibers themselves are fatigued in the act by tremulous vibrations. The intellectory pours forth whatever vital spirits it possesses and conceives, for the whole expends itself upon the new man, who is to be, as it were, he, the progenitor himself, and through whom he may preserve himself and his life, and pass through all the ages of the earth. At the same time, through the opened pores of the skin, the better and superfluous ejected exhalations are put forth, and hence are experienced the delicious ecstasies and pleasurable swoons of the interior sensories, which nevertheless in older persons are followed by temporary impotencies, and a kind of sadness and a coldness of the blood. In the act itself, which is of the body merely, there is a pleasure which is permitted without the end of procreation, but for the sake of bodily relief, since it is excited by the superfluous generative substance collected in the vesicles. As far as it is from the animus, it is without end, and is merely desire looking to the pleasure of the body. For the animus from itself exercises all acts in the body without end, since it feels and acts, but does not perceive, know, or will. But when the love descends from the rational mind, it deserves to be regarded no longer as effect merely, but as end. If it is regarded as effect or pure pleasure, it is lust or lasciviousness, for then the mind descends into the parts of the animus. But if it is regarded as an end, this is an indication that it descends from the pure intellect, since the pure intellect has regard to no effect of the body as an effect, but as an end. The end is the multiplication of members of a terrestrial society, the preservation of its own life through posterity, that it may pass into another self, then also the necessity of preserving the health of the body. This is the reason why brute animals act from the same principle and the same end, for their soul is like our pure intellect, and so regards or desires no spiritual ends, but only natural ones, that is, no celestial society such as our souls have in view. Venereal hatred and aversion. 206. There are those who from nature, and those who from principle or reason, have an aversion to venery. Those who from nature or of their pure intellect hold society and its multiplication in hatred are characterized by pride and an excessive love of self. Those whose rational mind and animus are affected by no charms are almost all sad and morose. Those whose blood is harder, colder, and whose animal spirit and its generation too scanty to suffice for its proper use, are old before their day, and those whose organs of generation suffer from disease are impotent. But they who from principle hate all venery regard it as vile and not to be yielded to, and its use as an injury to the spirit and to the better life. Thus the principles of this aversion are either spiritual or natural. This is called chastity, and is the highest virtue. End of section 19.